Office of Engineering in the War Department, or what, I forget what it was called. Here, War Office? I forget. At any rate, that's the first half of this. The second half of it is how it really got translated into American usage, particularly in the post-World War II years. The science, I did games as well, and still dabble in them when it's quite frankly profitable enough. For anybody who knows products like Mega Traveler for Games Design Workshop, this was my critter. Hard Times, there were a bunch of others too, but that's my show and tell piece. If you look for me in analog, you will find me there. And actually, both of these analog stories tie into the same future history, a sort of epic interstellar tale that is the solo novel that I'll be reading from second today. I started in this career actually quite a while ago, had to take a break, you know, basically to pay for kids and stuff. And was originally in these sort of things, War World with Jerry Purnell, anthology back in the early 90s. And now, if you were to look for me, you'd find me in these two things right now. This is the Ring of Fire series with Eric Flint, and Eric and I have a novel coming out called Papal States in October. What I'm going to read from first is Extremis. Extremis is part of the Starfire series, which is it's a sort of strange confluence of events in that Extremis, the first book that David Weber ever published, was part of the Starfire series. It was called Insurrection. He did it with Steve White. Steve White is still part of this series. And strangely enough, I take his seat. That doesn't mean I take his place, Steve White, on the series. So like I said, without further ado, I'm going to read you a chunk from Extremis. Now most of Extremis is, as the cover illustrates, set in space. It is military science fiction. It is mostly space combat. There's tons of that in here. You can pretty much anticipate what that's like. But I wanted to give you something a little different. This is ground combat, and I'll do some really quick setup here for you. The aliens in this, who were introduced in the book before, called Exodus, don't understand humans at all, and vice versa. And a lot of that has to do with the way we communicate, which is not merely not clear to each other, but not at all the same media, I guess you could say. They're capable of non-linguistic communication, which looks a lot to us something like telepathy. This creates some real concerns because they've always defined sentience as consistent with that. So there's a big distinction right away. They have occupied a central world in a particular part of this multi-speciate federation called Bellerophon, and have taken over one of its major cities called Melantho. Now, what they've done and the way they took it over is they landed part of their, they do not have at the beginning of the book faster than light travel. They arrived by generation ships, and they landed a huge part of this in bits next to Melantho. So basically off to one side of Melantho is their innate city, and there's a sort of dead zone between, or I guess you could say an interdiction zone between the part of Melantho they've taken over, their own city, and then a dead zone, interdiction zone, and the still human populated area. For a variety of reasons, our heroes in this story, the humans, need to get into their part of the city. How to do that has been a problem because the aliens are much more technologically advanced in a variety of ways, and they certainly have local superiority of force. So this is the answer to how they did it, and they are trying to actually rescue the wife of one of our lead characters here, a fellow by the name of Alessandro McGee. The chapter's title is Multum in Parvo, and that is from the Latin much and little. Melantho and Punt, Bellerophon, New Ardu. As emergency response chief Menachem Guzman watched, two more fires sprang up, one only a block away. The Baldy security sleds escorting his convoy of fire and rescue vehicles stopped and seemed to put sensors on the closest conflagration, which had started right at the border of the Heliobarmus district, but was now spreading quickly into the empty zone. What the Baldies were inspecting was unclear, since even they knew that all these fires had to be premeditated acts of arson. Maybe they were trying to discern if there was an ambush waiting nearby. An ambush. Menachem leaned his head down on the steering wheel. This day was either going to be very long or very, very short. And by the way, when I pause, there's a scene break, so there's a lot of cross-cutting here. Matube Ventrella, who ran the pressures and volume board for the water supply section of the Public Works Department, looked at the red-lined digital gauges nervously. As per your order, sir, water pressure is at max plus 6% in all lines running into the western fringe of the Heliobarbus district. Outflows? They're sealed, sir. This is not going to hold for long. Matube's supervisor looked over at the much-scarred man that neither of them had ever seen before this morning. He nodded. The supervisor turned back to Matube. Not long now. Mircea Basarab first thought that a large chunk of the flying plasticrete fragments had struck him on the shoulder, but then he felt the light blow again. He turned and discovered Modibo Jones preparing to thump him a third time. Modibo stopped, jabbed an urgent finger at his watch. Mircea released the porta-jack's power bar. The deafening hammering ceased. 1 minute, warned Modibo. Mircea nodded and turned back to face his adversary. A sealed section of Bellerophon's oldest sewer system, located beneath the western extents of the Heliobarbus district and 300 meters back from the empty zone, the old ceiling wall now looked like a pincushion. The two courses of old-fashioned cinder blocks, capped at either end by a good layer of plasticrete, had been intact when he had arrived just an hour ago. Since then, Mircea and Modibo had drilled dozens of equally spaced holes through to the open space on the other side. Mircea set the porta-jack's bit into the last half-drilled hole, depressed the power bar, and leaned into the resistance. After 15 seconds of pushing, he felt that split second of give, which meant he was about to break through. He backed off the power bar just as the bit plunged easily into the hole it had drilled. Its point had cut into open air on the other side. Mircea checked his watch and discovered the past 15 seconds had really been 30. Slinging the porta-jack over his shoulder as he yanked out the power feed, he hustled over to the steel ladder and fast-handed it upward right after Modibo. Like a dozen other similar teams throughout the area, they made a quick ascent to the street level just above them. One of Salamacene Bay's ubiquitous Richthofen fish, a triple-winged sea ray, started and plunged into the blue-black depths, its 3 rippling planes now pulsing in unison to accelerate its dive. A moment later, a submersible repair bot churned through the space just vacated by the fish. Its tired old prop housings gimbaled fitfully as its remote human operator kept it on course. Eventually, it reached the sheer face of what the locals called the drop, the 200-meter submarine cliff that also extended upward beyond the crashing waves, providing the high bedrock upon which the Heliobarbus district and the empty zone were perched. The ROV's prop can swiveled a bit, stabilizing. Then the fan slowed, counterspun, and stopped the unit just 2 meters from the vertical rock face. Along that rock face, a set of gray plastic conduits ran east to west. The ROV swung west, following the dim, cliff-hugging line. 10 seconds later, the bot's maneuver lights snapped on, revealing the intake fairing of an immense tube. The bot angled around the rim of the fairing, turned to face directly into the tube. It was plugged by a smooth surface, almost as smooth as the fairing itself. Esmeralda Chin, senior ROV operator in the remote maintenance section of the Public Works Department, turned to the swarthy, silent, muscular woman who was staring over her shoulder. The seal on the primary cooling intake is still solid, Esmeralda said. The woman nodded. So we go under, as we discussed. Esmeralda tilted the ROV's nose down and sent it diving under the lower rim of the tube's fairing. When the bot leveled off again, the fairing was directly overhead, but after a few meters of forward progress, it seemed to vanish upward into darkness. Esmeralda checked her instruments. I've got to be careful. It's unfinished rock in here from when they blasted into the cliff face. Crude method, commented the woman. Old method, corrected Esmeralda. The colony's first settlers built this fusion plant. Back then, the plants were big, cumbersome, crude. That's why the big water intakes for cooling. The woman nodded. Her short, tight ponytail bobbed. And that's good for us now. Snug us up under the tube. Okay. And now reverse gently and until the rear of the ROV makes contact with the backside of the ferry. Good. Can you angle up the nose a bit? Sure, Esmeralda complied. Okay, now what? Now you kill the lights. And wait. Wait. For what? But the short, dark, and very serious woman, who had become Esmeralda's one-day boss just 2 hours earlier, only checked her watch. The operator seated next to Esmeralda, section head Odile Jabouron, looked over at the woman. Time for me to start? The woman didn't look up from her watch, but said, go ahead. Odile adjusted her earbud and tapped her collar mic. Everybody with me? Green affirmation lights blinked on her board. The other 9 ROV operators scattered throughout her section were good to go. Okay, everyone, watch your intervals. Keep your speed low and be prepared to back fans at a moment's notice. Here we go. She looked to the short, dark woman who was now watching the video feed from the ROVs, arrayed like a tic-tac-toe board on Odile's auxiliary screen. The woman pushed out her slightly scarred chin. Seal and flood the lock. Odile tapped a virtual button on the margin of her own control screen, which showed the door behind the waiting ROVs descending as the water level in the chamber began to rise rapidly. As it did, yellow lights started pulsing at each end of the chamber, the ones in front revealing a sign above the 2-meter-wide iris valve centered in the far wall. Caution, sewage interface valve. Matuba Ventrella was surprised when his supervisor leaned over his shoulder and activated the control relays for the interfaces which, in an emergency, could link or flush the new water supply system into the old one. Sir, now open the pressure relief valves into grid blocks G14 through I12. Sir, with our water pressure at max +6, that's going to be like turning on a fire hose throughout the entirety of the old system. Some of the walls may not hold. The superintendent almost seemed to smile. They may not, he concluded. He conceded. Open the valves. Yes, sir. And swallowing down his anxiety and misgivings with an audible gulp, Matuba pressed the red virtual button that would unleash the underground equivalent of Noah's flood upon the walls and culverts and sluices that were, in many cases, 3 centuries old. In the same control building as Matuba, but 2 floors overhead, the short, muscular woman raised a finger and held it poised. Then she jabbed it at the control screen for the ROV, waiting patiently under the long-sealed tube in Salamacene Bay. Now. Esmeralda released the Waldo safety and maneuvered the manipulator arms of the ROV into an upright position. In the screen, she could see the large black waterproofed bundle clutched between them, held out like an ominous offering. She pushed the activation button. A short flash, a dying data squeal, and her screen went black. 27 seconds after Mercia and Modibo reached the street level and ran for their lives, the roaring, high-pressure plume that was Melantho's pent-up water supply slammed into the ceiling wall which they had thoroughly perforated with their power jacks. A wall, centuries old, unmaintained, and now deprived of structural integrity, let go with a sound like an explosion. Chunks and fragments propelled hundreds of meters down the abandoned sewer lines that led into the empty zone. The torrent howled through the opening, blasted its way westward. Rusted access doors buckled and gave, more walls washed away, bricks stripped off and tumbled down into the roiling cataract like hordes of Cubist lemmings diving to their watery deaths. With the full pressure of Melantho's entire water supply pent up behind it, the lateral geyser continued to blow a wide, west-streaming pathway through the long-abandoned subterranean warrens of what was now the empty zone. But the full pressure of Melantho's water supply was a Lilliputian force compared to the titanic blast of seawater that thundered and screamed into the defunct fusion plant's main coolant intake. The payload carried by Esmeralda's ROV, 10 kilograms of top-shelf plastic explosive, had completely torn off the sealed end of the tube. The inrushing jet of seawater roared south and hit the old plant's outer restraining wall. The wall lasted just long enough to double the pressure pushing outward against the sides of the tube, which bulged, seamed, and split in dozens of places. What had begun as one massive lateral geyser became a dozen lesser but equally forceful ones. Access doors and emergency runoff hatches were simply blasted out of the way. The foaming cataract expanded in all directions, spreading east, west, and south into almost every conduit that honeycombed the ground beneath that part of Melantho. As it went, it carried down walls, toppled stanchions, ruptured pipes, and significantly caught up and shattered the several dozen Arduin audio sensors with which the invaders had monitored the subterranean passages that joined West Shore to Heliobargus across the otherwise interdicted empty zone. Those 2 or 3 sensors that survived the deluge by dint of fortuitous placement or a quirk of fate were deafened and then drowned by the roar of rushing water and crumbling walls. Emergency Chief Menachem Guzman felt more than heard the faint rumble beneath the street. His driver slowed. The Baldy vehicles ahead had come to a dead stop. Human and aliens alike were looking around, unsure of both the cause and source of the sound. Menachem reached to target the command circuit that would allow him to speak to the rest of the vehicles in his convoy. He preferred manual controls, having learned not to trust to voice activation or other commo frills when in the midst of a genuine emergency. Just then, the rumbling abruptly grew louder. What the hell? He started. The old-style manhole cover in the intersection ahead of him was suddenly blasted upward, riding a vicious geyser of green-gray water up beyond the 4th story of the surrounding building. The nearest Baldy defense sled panicked and blasted the gushing hole with a quick rip from its remote Pintel-mounted autocannon, which then fell silent, almost as if embarrassed to have been seen shooting at a geyser. But a moment later, more manholes, one at every intersection, came flying off. A muffled, probably underground explosion reverberated somewhere farther inland, farther south. And then, starting with a deep growl that was audible above all the other noise, a 5-story building collapsed into the street just 2 blocks north of the convoy, the crash and dust rolling on longer than any sound of destruction that Menachem had ever heard. However, the long, final groan of the collapse didn't end. Rather, a similar sound had seamlessly taken its place, rolling suddenly louder, and then Guzman realized why. He gripped his assistant's arm. The water, it's rising. As he said it, water started gushing and moaning up through the long disused grates of Melanto's first and long decommissioned sewer system. The short, powerful woman with the ponytail leaned over Odile's shoulder and activated the remote address system. Your avenue of approach is now fully flooded, Tank. That's Alessandro's nickname. The ROVs are on their way. By the time the pressure lock recycles for your team, they'll have scouted your waypoints and demoed through the 4 separating walls you've identified, and any other obstructions that we might find. By the time you've water checked your gear, the backwasher should have steadied out, so when the interface valve opens, you'll be heading into still water and fully immersed passages. A deep voice answered. Roger that, Heike. On an adjacent screen, which was monitoring the surface of the access pool where the ROVs had started out, 23 black-suited divers rose to stand next to the slime-edged reservoir, small tanks and gear bags strapped to their backs. One by one, they stepped out over the ledge and plunged down into the murky water, hands held over face masks. McGee heard the link from the Department of Public Works Control Center open with a sputter of static. Tank? Asked Heike's voice. Right here. I'm opening the iris valve now. Fair warning, folks. There's a lot of lighter debris in the water. A couple of buildings went down up near the edge of the bay. Side flows took out the basement support beams. Looks like it. Because of how that junk spread downstream, I suggest rerouting your avenue of approach to alternate Baker 2. 30 meters longer, but you should then be able to use your C-scooters with wide open throttles the whole time. Not C-scooters, they're DPVs, said Harry as he adjusted his thermal imaging LI monocle. Diver propulsion vehicles. Perceptive Harry didn't seem to realize that he mercilessly corrected and annoyed Heike because he was utterly smitten with her. C-scooters are kids' toys. Call them whatever you like, jackass. Dilating the valve now. Good luck, Tank. Only 1,400 meters, and then it's showtime. The iris valve in front of McGee's assault group began opening like the shutter of an old-fashioned camera, but in slow motion. A light current, a thermal, pushed in at them. The water out there was colder. It was also both cleaner and greener, seawater from the bay. There was still a slow sway in the water, the last backwashes equaling out. Alessandro McGee toggled the open channel and turned to face the first rank of his team, Wismer, Lee, and Battisti. Okay, here we go. Keep a good interval. These C-scooters, he glanced at Lee and had the satisfaction of seeing an annoyed eye roll, run faster and hotter than the ones we had when we trained for underwater ops at Camp Gannon. Watch you don't snag on doorways or down beams. You've got less clearance than you think. Any questions? 22 faces hunched low behind the hand grips of their bullet-nosed DPVs, looked back at him. There were no comments. Okay then, follow me. Turning, McGee thumbed the sea scooter's throttle forward. Its fans spun up, and McGee let himself be tugged out into the cool green waters. He started steering toward the first waypoint. It was, he estimated, approximately 80 seconds away, and approximately 6 minutes more to the West Shore District and Baldy Central. To find out what happens when we get there, you're going to have to buy these. I've got all of 7 minutes, which gives me enough time to read the prologue for my solo book. It's called Fire with Fire. It is out probably in the second or third month of 2013. And this is, as you can probably tell from this, although the section I read shows you that I try to bring hard science fiction wherever I go, Extremis is in a lot of ways sort of like hard SF, military tech meets space opera in the sort of grand combat scheme. I think that would not be the way I would describe my solo, which is the launch of a series. It is very much hard science fiction, as you'll probably get the sense from this. This is, I don't think I even need to give an introduction since it is a prologue. Perry City, Luna, September 2105. Captain Chen of Taiwan's External Security Bureau stood very straight when his temporary commander, USS Admiral Nolan Corcoran, rounded the corner. Chen bowed quickly. Admiral Corcoran, a tall man whose appearance belied his advancing age, raised a silencing hand. He ignored Captain Chen's waiting covert ops team and moved instead to the cryogenic suspension unit resting on a gurney just behind them. Is that the intruder? Yes, Admiral. We found him right outside the door to your quarters. I'm sure you have the report by now. Yes, answered a second demand who came around the same corner that Corcoran had, but the details are sketchy. Chen did not recognize the man who spoke with an English accent. Apologies, sir. I relayed what I had at the time. The tall, thin Englishman looked up from his data slate. So you weren't present at the incident. Chen stood straighter, stared straight ahead. Nonetheless, I am the team leader, sir. Corcoran canted his head toward the Englishman. Mr. Downing is not implying you were at fault, Captain Chen. We know it's your job to report quickly and to take responsibility for what happens on your watch, even if you weren't there yourself. Now, what more have you learned since alerting us? The subject, Mr. Riordan, was detected near your quarters at 20 hours GMT, Admiral. He was behaving in a suspicious manner, apparently attempting to force entry. Since you had shared classified information with him earlier today, we feared that he intended to steal additional sensitive data from your suite. Downing stared at the cryogenic suspension unit. He resisted so strongly that you had to render him unconscious and stick him in a cold cell. Chen felt sweat rising on his upper lip. That was, in hindsight, an excessive response. However, when accosted, Riordan turned sharply and his hand was concealed in a bag. Our operative had originally conjectured it might hold tools, but now he feared it might conceal a weapon. So the subject was subdued. Corcoran nodded, but Chen noted, without the peripheral signs of approval that were common among Western commanders. That explains why he's unconscious. Why did you put him in a cold cell? Chen's upper lip was now thoroughly wet with perspiration. Sirs, you were on the far side. I had no way of knowing if you had received our communications, and we had to act quickly. Downing folded his arms. Why? I reasoned that Mr. Riordan's books might have made him too well known for us to detain until you returned. And if the local authorities had discovered him in our custody, that would have necessitated explaining why my team is here at all, thereby attracting more attention. I see the problem, Corcoran said. And Chen saw that he meant it, but was also disappointed. The American flag officer, famed for his boldness, would probably have waited longer, accepted a greater risk to avoid this outcome, because now that Kane Riordan was in cold sleep, there was no way to awaken him without calling attention to the covert activities being undertaken on Luna, which meant that, have you informed our contacts that we will need to initiate a missing presumed dead scenario to cover up Mr. Riordan's disappearance? Yes, sir. Very good. Mr. Downing will need access to the corridor security footage. We'll overwrite the recording of the incident with neutral view footage. See to that quickly, Rich. It would be just our luck for somebody to be reviewing the video logs already. The Englishman grumbled. Let's just hope it's not too late. He moved off to establish communication with their operative inside Perry City's security force. Corcoran turned back to Chen. And what were the contents of the bag? Chen handed it to the Admiral, who looked inside as Downing called over. We're clear. No spot checks on the security footage. The retired Admiral stared down into the bag for several seconds before handing it back to Chen. Keep the contents with Mr. Riordan for now. I'll have need of them later. Chen did not allow himself to look puzzled. Yes, sir. Downing had returned. He looked at Kane Riordan's deathly white face, made blue by the glass of the cryocell's lid. You know, I believed Riordan when he said he wouldn't reveal our work here. He shook his head. Somehow, I still believe him. Corcoran's response was quiet. Well, that's a moot point now. Downing shrugged. No tools for breaking and entering, then? He scanned the area. So what was in the bag? Nothing, answered Corcoran. Nothing of importance, at any rate. Chen almost started in surprise. Downing shook his head again. I'll make arrangements to have Riordan's cold cell shipped to our holding facility in Norwich. The Taiwanese will have to transfer Kane from their cryogenic system to ours first. We can't take receipt of a foreign cryocell. Too likely that someone will ask an awkward question. Downing nodded. Right, he said. I'll set up the exchange paperwork now. He moved off to send the necessary orders. When Downing was well out of earshot, Corcoran looked down at the cold cell again and spoke to Chen in a very low voice. Because your cryogenic technology is so different from ours, I imagine Mr. Riordan will experience a difficult reanimation. Oh no, Admiral, Chen corrected in a voice that was both deferential and enthusiastic. This cryocell utilizes Taiwan's improved pre-toxification system. It is vastly superior to our current models. Memory loss has been reduced to the same level as your slow freeze technology. Indeed, recent studies, Corcoran looked up from the cold cell, his eyes unblinking and direct. I said, Mr. Chen, that this will be a difficult reanimation. In fact, it will be very difficult, and I'm sure the memory loss will be even worse than with your older models. Corcoran still did not blink. Do I make myself clear? Chen had come to the conclusion that Western commanders were not particularly good at fixing underlings with stern, even terrifying stares. Now, looking into Nolan Corcoran's blue eyes, he suddenly found himself revising his opinion. Yes, Admiral. Mr. Riordan's reanimation will be most difficult, singularly difficult. But Corcoran was staring down at the cryocell again. The look on his face puzzled Chen. Was it guilt, regret, resolve, or all three? Chen turned to his security detachment. Flagged Mr. Riordan for augmented reanimation prior to transfer back to the U.S. authorities. What kind of augmentation? Asked his adjutant, already scribbling busily on his data pad. Short-term memory suppression, chemical and electroconvulsive. How intensive? Chen fixed his underling with a baleful stare of his own. Do you really have to ask? To find out what's going on the moon and every place else, you're going to need to look for Fire with Fire, coming early in 2013. Why Kane Riordan has been put into suspended animation is because he figured out on his own that the stuff on the far side of the moon was not an old asteroid impact, but an antimatter plant. The antimatter plant for propelling the first interstellar craft to Alpha Centauri, and that has to be kept silent. And from there on, it gets worse because he's in cold sleep for 13 years, and they wake him up to send him to take a look at the first report of evidence of exosapiens out on Delta Pavonis 3. To find out all about that, read Fire with Fire 2013. Thanks very much, folks. Thanks for coming 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. You guys are the troopers in the loyal.